All right, let's talk some NBA. Let's talk about the Illini's go-to guy right now in the NBA. They're hoping to add more Illini here in the future to the NBA. Terrence Shannon and Coleman Hawkins putting that off for a year. But Cody Westerlund covers the Chicago Bulls for 670 The Score, 670thescore.com. Cody, thanks for joining us, man. How you been?
I'm good. How you doing, Jeremy?
Doing well. For people that don't know, Cody Westerlund, Illinois grad, worked at the Daily Illini, worked at the News Gazette, was the Illini HQ recruiting reporter after me. So you got the connection here to Champaign, so the people know.
Yeah, it's I owe you a lot for just my early days. I still think you're the first person that ever put me on radio. So if there's any audio platform in which my opinions, analysis, or information offends anyone, you can just blame Jeremy, I think.
There you go. Well, Cody, let's get your intersection of Illinois and Chicago Bulls here. Let's start this off before we dive into where the Bulls are in the crossroads, probably off season or two that they're kind of facing here. But how would you evaluate Ayo Dosunmu's first two seasons as an NBA player so far?
I like the first one. I didn't like the second one as much, Jeremy. And I mean, pretty much all of it can be tied back to the outside shooting, right? He shot, I think, 31%, just a hair over from three-point range in his sophomore season in the NBA. So he's always been willing to do whatever the Bulls have needed and asked, but he just didn't attract enough defensive attention to take that next step in his second year. And it's not completely shocking, right? Like, there's a lot of players in the NBA that come on strong as a rookie, and then, the 82-game season can catch up to him. The adjustments from year to year, teams figure you out a little bit. So, again, not shocking. It's not like by any means his NBA career's been derailed, but you want to see him take the next step for his sake. If he returns to the Bulls in free agency, that would be for the Bulls' sake, obviously. But look, we know, and we've said this 100 times, I think, when we've talked before, good straight line driver to the hoop, can get out and transition, has good basketball IQ, but you want to just draw that defense out a little more to open up space for yourself and for your teammates that slash the hoop and some of those stars. So, I mean, when you look at his offseason, it all comes down to being a more consistent shooter.
Yeah, and he faced some big pressure early on in the season, right? Being the starter with Lonzo Ball out, and Lonzo, I think everybody knows, was such a connector, made everybody so much better. Why do you think he struggled in that role? Is it as simple as making shots?
Yeah, that's certainly a fair part of it, but it was a lot to ask Ayo to do what Lonzo was doing, right? Because Ayo has a little bit more of the lead guard mentality going back to his days with the Illini, right? Yeah. Being a scorer, whereas Lonzo's happy to be the fifth option. There are games where Lonzo would be happy to score 3 points, and I'm not saying that Ayo wouldn't be happy with that, but those two are wired completely differently. And then when Lonzo's out for a whole year, and he's not expected to play this upcoming year either, so we know how extensive those knee injuries are for him, it's really hard to ask Ayo to do what Lonzo was doing. And I think the Bulls were just kind of at a crossroads with their identity without Lonzo, because he's a premier defender. He's a high volume, good 3-point shooter. And Ayo is neither of those yet. Lonzo's a great hit ahead passer, whereas Ayo's more the guy that gets out on the break with the ball or gets the ball. So those things that they were asking him to do weren't natural to Ayo. Then you go into some of the things that it felt like were a little more natural to Ayo, like especially as a rookie. He had a pretty good connection with Nikola Vucevic, who the Bulls just re-signed on a 3-year deal. They had a good connection in the pick and roll game for a few weeks, and then it's like the Bulls didn't do a lot of that with those two. So he's the fifth option, and ask him to be a traditional point guard, do things that he didn't want to do. Like, he's just better served for this Bulls team, obviously coming off the bench. And he did that late in the season once they added Patrick Beverley, but I think he started 51 games for the Bulls as a sophomore. And sometimes it was a rocky road for that team as they struggled to find their identity. And that's on Billy Donovan, that's on the star players, and then that's on Ayo to fit in as they see fit.
He's a restricted free agent, Cody. Free agency starts on Friday evening. What are the scenarios for him this offseason?
Yeah, so the Bulls extended the qualifying offer, which, because he started over more than half the games of the season, is $5.2 million. So at any time Ayo wants, he could sign that 1-year contract for $5.2 million. But it sounds like he'd rather get a multi-year deal with more money guaranteed. So the Bulls will have matching rights in restricted free agency. If you're asking me for just one prediction, is he back or not? I would say more likely now that he's back with the Bulls than not. So I would say yes. And that's because look, they like him. They love his attitude. The fact that they found him in the draft and you want to draft and develop guys. So that is a tenet, even though the Bulls have thrown away a lot of draft capital to get some guys, they still do want to draft and develop as much as they can. And he's an example of this, of value where you picked him, certainly. So it just depends on that cost. Like the Bulls have some luxury tax questions. So like they're not going to sit there and get in a bidding war with anyone for Ayo, even if it's another team like that. We're not seeing $10-12 million a year here, a bidding war for Ayo annually, but they will be cognizant, I think is my point, of every few extra million with Ayo, which I think can kind of be a contradiction of other things they've done, right? Because there wasn't much tension in the negotiations with Nikola Vucevic. They brought him back, even though they probably weren't bidding against many other teams or have too much competition for his services. So it seems like in this organization, there's like a threshold for the Bulls where if you're a star player or you're a veteran or whatever, it's like you just kind of get your way. You know what I mean? Ayo's not at that level yet. So I do think they'll be aware of the contract, but I would look for him to probably sign a 2-year deal with the Bulls. I mean, maybe there's a third year in there where the team has a little bit of control over the option, or perhaps non-guaranteed money, something like that. But if you're Ayo, I mean, you can share your opinion here too. Like what's better for you, right? Like it's probably better, even if it's 2 years, $8 million, to get that $8 million guaranteed rather than 1 year, 5.2 and right, try to parlay it into something bigger. And that's not to say it's 2-8, like it could be 2-10, 2-12, who knows? I think $6 million would be certainly too much for Ayo annually, given what he's proved so far. But I mean, I think you're looking at a reasonable small contract that he can return to the Bulls on.
Yeah, and I think there's value of him being in Chicago, right? I think, personally, there's some value there, and I just don't know if he hits the open market. Like, is anybody going to restricted free agency 2 years, $20 million? I mean, there's teams that got to spend money, Cody, but I just don't know if I was.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? I listened to a ton of podcasts. I've talked to a few Bulls people about just this Ayo stuff, and it, like I said, seems more likely than not they'll come back. But like, I haven't really heard from anyone fits in free agency matching. And certainly when you're not a tier 1 or tier 2, tier 3 free agent, like there's not as much speculation around you. But it's weird because I don't have an exact team that he could go to. But at the same time, when you look at it, like because of the price range he'll be in, he could literally fit with any team that just wants a young guy or has some money to spend. And I think if you're the Bulls, I think that's the one thing I would be concerned about if I was the Bulls, as Ayo looks at other options. And we haven't got a read for him of like how much attachment to home or any sort of hometown discount he may be willing to give. But teams have to be within 90% of the salary floor when the season starts this year, right? So you got to be within 90%. Some of these young teams like took cap space into last season and didn't use it till later on extensions or take on back contracts. They'll feel pressured to sign and get to that floor, and they might want to overpay by a few million to someone like Ayo. So that's the one thing, if I'm the Bulls, I'd be keeping an eye on and be like, that's where I'm worried, is that teams are more inclined to spend money sooner this year than they would be in past years.
So what do you think Ayo Dosunmu's long-term outlook is in the NBA, Cody?
I mean, I think he's a bench player in the NBA, a rotation guy. It's interesting too. Like we always have these discussions in sports radio and podcasts, like, can I win a championship with so-and-so as my star players? My number one, my number two, this, that. Like, I don't think you're winning a championship if Ayo's your 6th or 7th man, but if he keeps progressing, there's no reason he can't be in the rotation at the end of a rotation of a successful team. So again, that all comes back so much to his shooting, right? Like, I feel like we kind of know what he is elsewhere as a player, right? Like, he's a solid defender. He's not a lockdown defender. Like, you're not throwing him out there on someone who's averaging 30 a game and efficiently and being confident that he's going to slow him down, but he plays well within the system. He generally knows where to go. He does a pretty good job fighting through screens most of the time. Now, the Bulls at times got in disarray, sometimes against good teams defensively in the last couple of years. But all in all, like, I feel like there's a foundation of you know what you're going to get from him night to night. And it goes back to the shooting element. And once again, not a lead playmaker for others, not a guy I envision averaging 7, 8, 9 assists in the NBA at any point, but knows where to pass the ball if he has attracted attention. So those are the things that I point as a playmaker. And he's not a premier athlete in the NBA by any sort whatsoever. So I think that probably limits his ceiling in some ways when you're looking at what's his future role. That's probably why it's not starting material long-term on a good team, which isn't to say he won't keep getting starts the way the NBA goes and how he has been reliable.
All right, Cody, let's focus on the Bulls at large here. How would you describe the state of the Chicago Bulls right now?
Extremely average, just average, locking themselves into an average state of mind coming off this 40 and 42 year. The best way to describe bringing Vooch back on a 3-year, $60 million deal is that it wasn't good and it wasn't bad. It literally just existed in the realm of something they needed to do and was not going to tank their team and was not going to elevate their team. And that is separate in ways from the transaction that they acquired him in, right? They are in this situation because they don't have a lot of draft capital moving forward. Vooch has some limitations in his game, but then you look elsewhere on the roster. It's Vooch isn't the main problem, but you go around all these players, Zach LaVine's not the main problem for the Bulls. I don't know that DeMar DeRozan is the main problem for the Bulls. Vooch isn't the main problem for the Bulls, but DeMar and Vooch don't shoot 3-pointers at a high level, and that's a huge problem for the Bulls. The Bulls are very limited what they can do defensively to cover for DeMar and Vooch's deficiencies. In the way they need to play. They need to have Caruso and Ball out there. They need Vooch at times to drop or not be aggressive in pick and roll coverage or they'll get burnt. So there's all these limitations placed on the team because they've spent big money on players that have limitations in certain areas and don't really uplift everyone else. And Zach LaVine in his own way is that as well, right? Really efficient offensive scorer, but he struggled for long stretches in crunch time. He doesn't take care of the ball well enough, and he's been better defensively, but still is not by any means anything better than average probably in that department on a good day. So it's kind of depressing when you think of it in those terms because it does seem so difficult for this team to elevate to the next level, and they've been locked in by their past moves. And I think there's a fair number of fans that would say they've been doomed by those moves because the expectations certainly are higher than the play-in tournament and even higher than the 6th seed they got a couple of years ago.
The one thing is these moves might not have worked out with Alonzo Ball's injury. Vooch, it was too expensive. I like him as a player. I think he's a really good player. I think he's fun to watch. He needs to make more threes, but he's as you said, he's not their problem. But there was some creativity. There was some, I guess, ingenuitiveness that I haven't seen from a Bulls front office in a while. But then this last year, Arturas Karnisovas and Mark Eversley, I guess last 2 years, Cody, just kind of been stagnant here. What has happened there? And what are your impressions of this front office since then? And, really since the Lonzo injury and what this next week or so means for them?
There's 2 reasons I think they're stagnant. One is because they did use so much draft capital to acquire Vooch and DeMar DeRozan. So naturally they couldn't be as aggressive. They haven't been a team that's gone past the luxury tax either. So that constrains you a little bit. But then I think they've also fallen in love with some of their players. I think Kobe White's a perfect example, which maybe they're going to be proved right in this situation because he had a strong year last year. I thought much better as an all-around player. And it's certainly tracking toward bringing Kobe White back. But they could have traded him for sure and shook up the roster a little bit in some ways, maybe get a bigger forward at some point. I mean, he was tied to the Grizzlies in trade speculation in the last 2-3 years, even stuff like that. And they have 100 wings, it seems like, on that team and forwards and stuff just guys like that, situations where they probably could have flipped Kobe for some sort of late draft pick or I don't know for sure what draft pick they could have flipped him for, but had him in deals where they got draft capital in some way. And they didn't do that. Why? Because I think they at the time valued him a little higher than what he was playing like. And that's the same thing it sounds like with Zach LaVine being shopped a little bit on the trade market lately. It sounds like teams are hanging up fairly quickly after the Bulls contact them to gauge the interest. So I think it's the lack of draft capital led to that, overvalue their own players a little bit more. And like, also, if you want to keep going down the list, like a steadfast belief in what they built when Lonzo Ball was healthy, and then this false hope that Lonzo somehow would have been healthy at some point last year or moving forward this year. Finally, at long last, it sounds like Arturas Karnisovas is publicly revealing and acknowledging that Lonzo's not going to come back this year, and they're not operating as if he will. They probably should have done that 6 months ago even. And they would say they did a little bit by getting Patrick Beverley on the buyout market for late in the season and everything. But it's a little bit of stubbornness, I think, for this front office, because they like and trusted what they built, but there was only a 45 game stretch maybe when that was fully operational and healthy. So that's why, I mean, for a couple transaction cycles, certainly last year, free agency, all they did was add Drummond and Goran Dragic. Really, that's basically just punting free agency, and then a couple trade deadlines. They didn't really do anything. So it's like 3 big transaction cycles more or less went by without them doing much. So you understood a little bit why they had their hands tied, and then a little bit they just chose not to because they liked what they had before.
So what do you expect out of them now? Is it continuity still, or do they try and shake this up? Do they look? I mean, we've heard the price on LaVine is high. I understand he's really good. He's a really good player. Is there any value for a DeMar DeRozan? For me, it's hard to find a fit for such a central player.
I thought DeMar would be. I mean, you always look at Los Angeles teams. Both of them, Clippers and Lakers, have had interest in him before he wanted to play in the Los Angeles, obviously, at some point in his career. So I always turn to there. But past them, it's kind of hard, right? Now it sounds like the Clippers obviously are shopping Paul George a little bit. So maybe they want to put someone else in, but are they chasing James Harden? That's going to take DeMar DeRozan off the map, stuff like this. You know what I mean? Like, there's so many permutations, and the Bulls don't have these players that are like the number one star of the offseason. So they have to wait for things to play out sometimes. So I expect him to keep shopping Zach LaVine, right? Like, and I think they're right to set a high price when they shop him, because there's no doubt. I mean, as long as he's healthy, and he was healthy last year after that slow start, sitting out a few games, he's going to be worth just as much at the trade deadline this upcoming year as he is right now if he's healthy. So like, there's no reason to trade him just for the sake of trading him yet at this time, I don't think. But I don't know. It's hard. Like, if you ask me what I expect, I expect the same core 3 to come back, and for the Bulls to add some shooting with the mid-level exception in free agency, maybe another shooter on the biannual exception, and for them to let Javonte Green go. Derek Jones has already opted out of his player option, so I expect him to go. So like how different will the roster look? And I'm like, well, it'll probably look different at the 8 and 9 spots on the roster. If they're lucky, the 6th man, you know what I mean? In this case. So they're juggling like 2 trains of thought right now that bring them back, do the same thing, but also we don't love Zach enough to commit to building around him. So we're just going to keep taking phone calls on him or calling other people. And like, this goes back, I think, to like last season when we first saw the friction a little bit pop up was when Billy Donovan benched Zach LaVine late in a home game against the Magic. I think it was in November, if I remember correctly, but it was early in the season. And Zach didn't take kindly to that at all. And like, it's just kind of always been a reminder that like the Bulls like Zach. They don't love Zach at any point.
I feel the same way as the Bulls. So like, I there's nights I'm like, hey, that guy could be Jamal Murray. And then there's other nights where I'm like, well, he's getting the chances and he just does. There's just something missing there. To
me, it makes more sense to trade DeMar. Yes. But like, the counter argument to what I just stated is like, we did see that for like a month and a half the first year they acquired Vooch at the deadline, and it went really poorly. Like, it was pretty uninspiring too. There wasn't much chemistry or cohesion there. But to me, it's like, there's no market out there for Vooch right now. They were probably better off trading DeMar at the last trade deadline if they wanted to get a little more, but I still think he could certainly help a contender. but like it would just be a small trade market. I personally would trade him for like any two assets that's like a protected first round pick and a young player who could be in my rotation. I would deal him because he only has 1 year left. And you could just make an argument that salary filler and 1 first round pick. But I don't think the Bulls can swallow their pride enough to do it for that little probably. But like, I would like to see a shakeup somehow in the core. And like, I would not be offended by any of them going, right? Because the mix has to change somehow. I like keeping Zach LaVine more because of his efficiency on offense and 3-point shooting game. But again, like there's just no evidence that like he's elevated them to anything past average at best in his career. So you can make the argument for any of them to ship them out, and it feels like they're still going to be around average at best or start tanking.
Yeah, so I'll just throw my thoughts at you about what they should do, because I agree with you. I don't think they're going to get the price they want for Zach LaVine, and I understand. Like I understand setting a high price for a guy who's one of the most efficient scorers in the NBA. He's 28 years old. His deal is affordable in today's NBA. So I think the most likely is keep him. Obviously, Vooch they're keeping. DeMar, you're not going to get a lot for, but I just feel like you have to give Zach LaVine the chance, Vooch the chance. And to be honest with you, you can't give up on a guy when he's 21, 22 years old. So give Patrick Williams the opportunity. Like, let's see what he is. Let's see what Kobe White is. If it fails, it fails. I love DeMar DeRozan. I love everything he brings. I wish Zach LaVine had a little bit more of that killer. Maybe that's unfair, but I just don't see it as much in him. And then I love Alex Caruso. He's my spirit animal. He's got so much value right now. Yeah. I feel like if you can flip him for young assets, future picks or whatever, like
great contract for Caruso.
And every team that's a contender needs Alex Caruso. So I feel like that's my way of retooling. It's not a complete reset. It's not a complete rebuild. I don't know if you want to tank with this draft coming up. So I think
the draft's not very good for the next 2 years.
Yeah,
it doesn't sound like.
It's like DeRozan, Caruso. Those would be my trade pieces I've been putting
the
out.
Zach thing, like to me, if you want to share his viewpoint, would be like the Bulls have never really put anyone next to Zach that helps cover for him or uplift his talent. Like they've never got a couple good 3-and-D guys alongside of him, right? Like early in his career, it was like Chris Dunn. And I mean, it's been a rotation at point guard. No one's really ever worked out to Lonzo, obviously. And the one time he had more of a 3-and-D guy with Lonzo, it did work for that stretch. So like they haven't gotten a stopper in the backcourt that can help provide space for Zach. Like Kobe White as a rookie is not doing that back in his career. Tomas Satoransky was not that player. So like they've never done a good job building around Zach, just like the previous front office, like never surrounded Jimmy Butler with shooting either to see where he could take his offensive game to the next level and a team to the next level. And I mean, everyone wants shooting in 3-and-D in the NBA. So it's more difficult than easier said than done, obviously. But like, I don't think they have done their best effort yet in surrounding Zach with what he might need to take the next step. If you want to share his viewpoint that like, look, he and his camp hold those types of viewpoints behind the scenes, you know, like surround us a little bit more with what we need as a team.
Which is why I get frustrated. Like I was so excited. They actually traded into the second round in the high second round and bought a pick. Now you have future assets you're giving up for that, but then they drafted a guy who's talented and Julian Phillips, but he's not a shooter unless they found some mechanical fix. Like,
I mean, that's the type of the whole front office. It's like Ayo when they drafted him too. Like, great. I mean, good scorer, understands basketball, can do a few things, play defense, but just doesn't have a consistent outside shot. On him, Dalen Terry or Julian Phillips. Now, I mean, that's 3 draft picks, I think, out of like the 5 they've had as the Bulls front office.
Last question for you. What do you think? The Lauri Markkanen thing, I was always high on him. I thought he could be good, but obviously he just wasn't that good. Never kind of last couple of years of the Bulls, maybe it's on the Bulls, didn't take that step. He goes to Utah where he gets so much usage, really flourishes, but it kind of teaches us, hey, don't give up on 20-something, 23, 24-year-olds. So do you have any hope for Patrick Williams to take a huge leap at any point?
I love Patrick Williams' shooting ability. I have hope in him as a player. I think he can be very good. I need to see a little bit more of the tough-mindedness, I think, right? I do think he's had too many confidence issues, especially for a guy who hasn't like shouldn't have a reason to be as down on himself as he is at times. So, yeah, I have a lot of hope for Patrick Williams. Like I'm 41, 42% from 3-point range. I mean, he's always shooting over 80% from the free throw line. Like, that's a good touch he has. Like, there's a ton to work with. There should be no business of moving on from Patrick Williams whatsoever if you're the Bulls, unless you're getting a star player in a trade, and he's part of that. I would not treat him in any way, shape, or form like they treated Lauri Markkanen, right? Like, you need to learn from that mistake, because Lauri had a lot of talent too. And like, look, some of the same things in Chicago, Lauri would say sometimes he didn't get the opportunity, didn't like where he is in the offense. I think more for Patrick Williams, it is he doesn't get the opportunity yet because of the big three offensive guys the Bulls have, which, going back to your earlier point, Jeremy, you pointed out, would be a good reason to move on from one of those three to give him more opportunity. I support that too. So like, my concern with Patrick Williams, if you want to bring it up, is he's not a good passer. He basically has, I don't know if he has more career turnovers than assists or if it's like a 1-to-1 ratio exactly, but he's a bad passer. So he needs to be a play finisher, right? Like, he needs to be end of the line score. I don't think he's making plays for others, right? Like maybe once every 2 weeks he makes a really nice pass and people cut the highlight on Twitter and go crazy. I'm like, have you watched the other 13 days of him in these last 2 weeks? Like, it's just, he hasn't done anything from a playmaking perspective. So he needs to focus on getting a killer mentality to be a scoring finisher, because he can do that efficiently. He has the physical tools to do it. And I think he can find his lane there, an identity there. And if he understands what he needs to do, I think those confidence problems go out the window. And then you see an efficient player who is capable of being an all-star, an efficient scorer, and go from there and have a building block. But you got to have lead playmakers, and I don't see that in his future for the Bulls. So good piece. I like him. I'm hopeful, but you have to understand, I think, how he fits into the picture.
Yeah, I feel like this year they just need to give him opportunity. Like, they just force feed him and grow that confidence, see what he can become. Cody Westerlund, 670 The Score. You can follow him on Twitter at Cody Westerlund. Cody, appreciate the insight on Iowa and the Bulls, man.
Yep, anytime. Thanks, Jeremy.